Hi, good evening. My name is Kim Ellson. I'm a U of I Extension educator. I teach horticulture. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. If everybody could please make sure that you keep your microphone muted. We are going to be recording this tonight, so please just keep that mic muted, especially if you call in on your audio phone. Go ahead and mute that for us. So today we're going to be talking about seed starting. And I personally love this topic just because I think we're all the same. Sadly, most of us don't get to steal away and go wait for the winter time to Florida or somewhere nice. We're all stuck in that cold climate. And being that we're keen gardeners, after a few months of cold, we're desperate to get out there and do something and grow something. So the wonderful thing with seeds is we get to start ahead of time. We can start early when it is still cold and miserable out. So I wanted to speak today about some basics about seed starting. Then I want to look at which plants would you grow from seed, what grows well from seed. And we'll just touch upon a few things like hybrids and cultivars, if things will come true from seed or not. Then we're going to go through the basics of, first of all, when you would want to start your seed, how you would want to start that seed in terms of what you would grow it in, the medium, the pots, how we would take care of that, how we would troubleshoot a few basic problems, and then we're going to look at breaking some dormancy requirements at the very end to finish up with. Hopefully all of that should give you a nice little overview so you'll be ready to go starting next month or the month after to start your seeds for this year's season. We have many different types of methods of propagating plants. So the main difference between seeds and any other form of propagation is that seeding is what we refer to as sexual propagation. We have two main categories for propagation. We have sexual and we have asexual propagation. Asexual is also often referred to as vegetative propagation. So that main difference is that all of our asexual or vegetative propagation methods, such as taking cuttings or grafting or simply dividing your plants, air layering, all of those produce what we refer to as clones, genetic clones of that parent plant. So anytime we're doing vegetative propagation, we have a single parent, so we're always going to get a clone. Now with seeds, on the other hand, we have two parents coming together, meaning we have two gene pools coming together. Those gene pools are going to mix, and we're going to get diversity with those seeds. So this could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing, depending on what it is you're after. Many times for growers, they do not want diversity. Many times it's taken them many years to come up with that perfect plant. They want to make sure that they're now creating clones of that plant. They don't want diversity. Nature, on the other hand, wants diversity all the time. So a diverse system is a more resilient system. So you have to decide what it is you're after. But that's sort of the main difference between all our propagation methods in a nutshell. So why would you want to grow things from seed? Well, sometimes it's the only option you have. So depending on what you're growing, maybe you want to grow a tree or a shrub, sometimes seed is the only option. Some things might not be possible to grow them from root cuttings or leaf cuttings or a grafting method, so you're simply stuck with seed. Other times, maybe what you want to grow, the species or the cultivar you wish to grow, is something that's more unusual. It's not commercially available. So then again, seed would be the best option for you. Keeping in mind, when you go to that garden center, they only have so much floor space. They can only display so many different live plants. It takes a lot of space for live plants. Seed, on the other hand, you can have endless different seed, very easy to store, very easy to display, very inexpensive. Maybe what you're wishing to grow is something that you can't get locally. Maybe it's coming from abroad. Maybe you happen to be a collector or a hobby grower of something specific and you want something a little unusual, then it would be easiest to order it from seed. The other thing with seed is that it's very inexpensive usually. So nature is very generous. Nature provides us with endless seed all the time, making seed a nice inexpensive option. Also with seed, keeping in mind, you've become the grower. So rather than paying somebody else to do the work of sowing that seed and nurturing that seed, making sure it germinates, watering it, fertilizing that plant, paying for energy costs, you're going to do all of that yourself. So you're going to take all of that cost out of the equation. So price is a great reason to grow from seed. I always think, being a keen gardener myself, and I'm sure all of you are keen gardeners that are listening, it's simply fun. So when you're growing things in your garden, what more rewarding than to be able to save your own seed? Or even if you've gone out and purchased seed, it's really wonderful and satisfying to sow that seed and to see it popping up. So exciting when you see things coming up and you didn't know if it was going to grow or not. To nurture that plant along, to be able to plant it out into your garden, and depending on what it is, either enjoy the blooms later in the season or watch butterflies or something else enjoy those blooms, or maybe ending up eating whatever you've grown. So you really treasure that plant more when you've grown it right from the very beginning. Now there are some plants that aren't as suitable for collecting seed, and I just want to touch on that a little bit. So next time when you go out and purchase a pack of seeds, try and look at what it says on that seed packet and be aware of certain terms, like if it says F1 hybrid, maybe it'll say cultivar. Have a look at those keywords on the front of that packet. A hybrid is one of the few plants I would not recommend that you collect seed from and grow yourself. So hybrids, many times you're going to see those with your vegetables, tomatoes, many other things will be hybrids. So why do we not want to collect seed from hybrids? Because if I collect seed from a hybrid plant and I grow it again next year, it is not going to come true to type. In other words, say I had a big beef tomato and I collected that seed from that tomato plant and I sowed it the following years, I would not get that big beef tomato again. Why? Because a hybrid is when I've taken two pure lines of different parentages and I cross those two pure lines, those parental lines, for the very first time. And when I say a pure line, what this means is that a grower has very diligently taken that one parent plant and kept self-pollinating it continuously. Depending on the plant, this could be 10 generations, it could be more, until they're absolutely certain they have a pure line with those traits in that plant that they're seeking. Those two pure lines can only be crossed once to get that F1 hybrid seed. So F standing for filial, it's that first generation seed. If I collected that seed from that F1 plant, what I would then have the following year is what we call an F2 plant, and it would not display the same characteristics. Could I collect the seed? By all means you could. And if I collected 100 seed, maybe I would get 2 or 3 that were that big beef tomato, but the majority of them would not be. So I would see a whole wide range of diversity of different parental traits. So just be a little aware of that. So if you have something, you purchased a plant or a seed, and that's what it was, don't be surprised if the plant you grow the following year doesn't come true to type. The other thing, when I speak of seeds and say it is a low cost, do be aware that with hybrids you will always be spending more money. And that's simply because, as I was describing that process, there's a lot of work involved for that grower to keep maintaining. They have to consistently keep maintaining those two parental pure lines. They have to consistently keep making that very first cross. Some of these things all still have to be done by hand, so it's always going to be a lot more expensive. Now, many times they'll try and hide this. So if you purchase a packet of seeds and a packet of hybrid seeds, the price difference won't be very much, but you might have several hundred in the one pack, you might only have 25 in the other. So that way it's not as obvious to the buyer, but the price difference is still there. So which plants are good to collect seeds from? Annuals are wonderful. Keeping in mind with an annual plant goes through its entire life cycle within a 12-month period, meaning I'm going to get seed every single year. So annuals, as you know, they have to germinate, grow, mature, bloom, and set seed all within 12 months. So the only way that annual plant can come back again next year is to return by a seed, because that plant perishes at the end of the year. So a characteristic of annuals is that they churn out a ton of seed to ensure their existence from year to year. So annuals are always going to ensure that we have endless seed that's available, and they're going to ensure that I don't have to wait 4, 5, 6, 7 years for that plant to mature enough to produce seed. Herbs and vegetables are fantastic because they germinate quickly and they grow readily. When I say herbs, our herbaceous herbs, not really our woody herbs, because they're going to be much slower and more difficult to grow. So things like basil, cilantro, parsley, for example. Vegetables too, they're very inexpensive to purchase the seed, and they grow very, very rapidly. So the characteristics we want to look for in plants that are really user-friendly to be grown from seed are something that will germinate easily, something that will grow rapidly, and seed that's readily available and inexpensive. And seed that's going to come true to type as well, unless I'm going out and purchasing it specifically. So once you've decided what you want to grow and you think that seed is a good option, because sometimes it might just be easier to purchase a plant, some things might best be grown from seed, others not, then you want to start to think about when you want to grow it. So it's absolutely essential to schedule these things. And it might seem a little over the top. You think, well, surely I can just start growing it, and when it's ready, you know, if the weather's not quite right, I'll keep it inside a few more weeks. If it's ready, I'll plant it out. We really want to try and avoid that scenario. So we want to try and time it as closely as possible. So as soon as those plants are ready to go out, they can go out. In other words, the weather's going to allow them to be planted out. So you want to sit down and start to think about, what do I want? Look at that seed packet. That seed packet's many times going to give you a lot of information, such as how long will that seed take to germinate, how long will it take to grow. So that'll tell you, you can work with that information, add up those days to germinate, days to maturity, and then start looking at when am I going to put that plant out. If it is a frost tender plant, I want to look at my area, my zone. I want to figure out what my last frost state is. Maybe sometimes you still want to add a few days onto that. And then I want to work back from that day. If it is something that's hardy, you know, you can think, well, simply when do I want to put it out? What seems like a good suitable time when the ground isn't frozen? And again, work back from that date. So if you're growing more things, try and group things together based upon their frost tenderness, when you can plant them out, and maybe they have a similar growing length cycle. So what are the problems if you do not schedule things well? And I know many times it's very tempting not to do it. You have to be a very diligent gardener to start sitting down with your calendar and working these things out. I realize it's not the norm. Generally, if you happen to have a little time, maybe you have nothing to do one weekend, you think, okay, let's go, let me seed everything and get it done. Problem is, though, if I seed everything and my plants are ready to go out, maybe I've grown tomatoes and peppers, they're ready to go out, but it's too cold, I cannot plant them out. What's going to happen is those plants are going to start to suffer. Many times they're going to start to stretch. So if they have insufficient light, they're going to start to stretch. Very few of you are going to have greenhouses. Most of us are going to be starting these plants indoors, meaning many times our light levels will be insufficient. Many times it's going to be too warm in your house. So generally we want our temperatures warmer than many of our plants should grow at. So most of our seedlings we want to grow cool. Again, if they're too warm, stretching will be another side effect. If I've grown things in seed flats or in cell packs and they're ready to be planted out and I cannot plant them out yet and they have to remain in those for a few more weeks, then those plants are going to start to become stunted because they're going to run out of root space. Those roots are going to start to intergrow. Those plants are going to start to crowd each other and fight and compete for light. Maybe they're going to run out of nutrients in that limited soil that's available to them. So all these different factors, a lack of light, temperatures that are too warm, a lack of air circulation in the home, all these things are going to make your plant susceptible to pests and diseases. So we want to try and time it as closely as possible. So here's a picture right here. If you look at that picture on the left, you can see how those roots are all completely intertangled at the bottom. So this is something we really want to avoid. Imagine if I had to start splitting those plants up, and those are peas, and to plant each one individually. It would almost be impossible without really severely interfering with those roots and disturbing those plants and breaking and damaging a lot of those roots. Also, if I were to look at those plants from the top down, all I would see is green. Anytime I'm growing plants together, I want to be able to look down at them from the top down and still see soil. I don't want to just see foliage. That means they're competing for light and they have a lack of light. Now in this case, this actually happens to be an exception because this was grown as a microgreen. In other words, I'm now going to chop those off at the base, I'm going to consume those, and I'm going to throw the rest away. So always think about what is the intended use of that plant. If my intended use was to plant it out, I should have planted it out a long time ago. Maybe I should start something directly outdoors. If my intended use now was to cut it down, this would be fine. I wouldn't have to worry about that root mass. On the right, the picture we can see, so this would be a better use of my space. I've got 3 beans in a pot right here. They won't overcrowd each other. And once they start to pop up and grow, I can plant them out as a whole. Seed packets, like I mentioned earlier, have a ton of information on them. And I know we get drawn in by the pictures, we love them, we pick up that seed packet, but many times we don't look at that information really well on those packets. Try and sit down next time with your seed packets and just look at them a little closer. When I look at this seed packet in front of us right now, these radishes, you can see it says organic on there, for example. Organic means that the parents of that plant from which the seed was collected were not treated with synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. So that might be of importance to you, especially if you're growing edibles. The seed packet might tell you something like heirloom. It might tell you something like open pollinated. So if I had something that was open pollinated, I wouldn't have to worry about that plant being cross-contaminated by other plants cross-pollinating it. I see it says radish cherry bell on there, so cherry bell is my cultivar. So almost every plant you purchase these days is going to be a cultivar unless it happens to be one of those few native species out there. If I look at it, it says 4 grams on there, so usually seed packets will tell us the weight rather than the amount of seed. Sometimes it's different, but often it goes by weight. It's also telling me on the front of that seed packet that it has 22 days to maturity. If I look on the back of this packet, and don't get confused, these are 2 different packets, so one's pumpkins, one's radishes. Then it's going to start to tell me those basic growing rules, like how deep should I sow that seed, how far apart should I sow that seed, how long will it take till harvest. Sometimes it might tell me basic things like the seed is best direct sown outdoors. It does not take to transplanting. It might tell me things like frost tenderness. It might tell me my growing soil, when I can direct sow it outdoors. So lots of really relevant information on there. The other thing, if you look at the bottom of that packet on the right, it says it's packed for 2012. So seed packets do have a sell date on them always. So the general rule is seeds should only be sold for that year that it's packaged in. So you should never be purchasing last year's seed at full price. Many times the grower, the nursery, the garden center is either going to send it back to that seed company or they're going to donate that seed. If you do see last year's seed there, you should always be purchasing it at a discounted rate. So once we've decided when we're going to seed, then we're going to start to look at how we want to seed our plants. What do I want to grow it in? Now, depending on what you want to grow and especially how much of something you want to grow, it's really going to largely dictate what you want to grow it in. Some plants, just be aware, you're best off just direct sowing them outdoors. So especially things like root vegetables don't take so well to being transplanted. For me, generally, all my cold season veggies, I prefer to just direct start them outside. That way they can root in right off the bat, and I don't then have to worry about trying to harden them off before I plant them out. I personally like seed flats a lot, and the seed flat is the one you see on the bottom left of this picture. It's about 1.5 inches deep. The nice thing with a seed flat is, I'm going to be talking about bottom heat in a little while. That seed flat perfectly fits one of our heating mats, so you can sit that on that heating mat. You do not have to have just one species of plant in a seed flat. If I was looking at one of those average size seed flats, I could have 500 of one plant in there. I'm sure most of you don't want 500 of one thing. So that's when I could do simple rows of different things in that flat, or sections of different things. That way I can still start everything off on that heat mat before I transplant it. Now the downside with a seed flat is, depending on how much work you want to do with that seed, you will have to pot it up rapidly once it starts to germinate. It has very little space to root in. We don't want those roots to start intergrowing, so you really want to pot it up as soon as it pops up and grows just a little. Me, for example, I love playing with my seed and fussing around and having a reason to have to go and work with it, so I'm happy to have to pot them up several times. Other people might want to be able to direct sow it into one of these individual pots and not have to touch it again until it's ready to be transplanted in the garden. So that's entirely up to you. A cell pack, which is another one of these long flats, which would also fit that heating mat well. The nice thing with the cell packs is that they're deeper, so that again might be something that I could sow it in there and not have to pot it up at all and be able to directly transplant it outside. It would give me a little more wiggle room, even if I did want to still pot it up, that plant would not start to get stunted as quickly and need to be potted up as quickly as if it were in that seed flat. Next, we're going to look at medium. So what do we want to grow it in? Usually, I'm the type of person, I always tell most people, you can grow most things in a decent potting soil. There's so many different soils out there, and when I say soils, I mean soilless mixes, like our potting soils. So something that's made out of peat, bark, perlite, vermiculite. A decent potting soil, you can grow most things in it. Seed is one of the few times I make an exception to that rule, and I would recommend you go out and get what's referred to as a seeding mix or a germination mix. So the difference in your seeding mix as opposed to traditional potting soil, it's still one of those soilless mixes, it's still sterile, but it's a lot finer, so it doesn't have those larger chunks of bark in there, for example. It's a really nice fine mix, and it has little to no fertilizer in it. So I want that fine mix because, keeping in mind, if I have seed in there, very small seed, any little clump in there could be like a mountain for that seed to overcome, and I might get uneven germination. Also, if I have fertilizer or substantial fertilizer in that potting mix, it might burn those roots and burn those seeds. Now, if you want to use a potting soil, by all means, go ahead and try it. I'm sure it won't do any harm, but make absolutely certain that you break it up in your hands and make sure you get it really nice and fine prior to using it. Now, sometimes people will still like to put vermiculite over the top. And that's what this picture on the right is showing. So they filled that flat with seeding mix, they've sown the seed, and then they've just topped it off with vermiculite. So vermiculite is used, it'll absorb the moisture, it's nice and light, so it's easy for that seed to poke through, and it'll keep the soil in that flat. If you want to use it or not, that's entirely up to you. It works very well with and without it. Now, if you look at this picture on the right, you can see what I've done here is I've literally just put a whole bunch of seed flats next to each other. I like to do this when you're doing more seeding. This way I can go ahead and fill them all with that seeding mix, go ahead and break up any clumps, and then I simply take an empty seed flat and I keep going over the top of it to level it out. You want to get it as level as you can possibly get it. Doesn't seem like much, but when you have fine seed again and you have divots, you're going to have some areas that are going to be drier than others, some areas that are going to be lower, seed might move, so all of that's going to lead to uneven germination. So try and get it as level as possible. Then what I like to do is to water those flats prior to seeding. And that's something that works really well. If I water those flats prior to seeding, what I'm doing is, A, by having that soil wet when I sow my seed, it acts like a bit of a glue, so when that seed hits the soil, it automatically stays where it is, it doesn't move around. If there's a little air current in a greenhouse or wherever you're working, it's not going to move that seed at all. Also, if you think of the nature of any potting soil or seeding soil, you know it can always absorb a ton of moisture. You know, it's like a sponge, it just soaks it up. So if I can pre-water that, because we really want to make sure that that soil is wet thoroughly before we seed. So I have to keep going over those flats over and over and over until it's thoroughly wet. Now if I had seeded and I had to go over them that often to get it really wet, the danger is I'm going to move that seed around a lot. So by me doing that prior, I'm not going to have that danger of moving the seed around. Really try and make sure that whether you're using a watering can, whether you're using a hose, make sure that that nozzle head on the top is a really, really nice fine spray. I don't want large droplets coming down. I don't want dirt in that nozzle head so that I have an uneven spray coming out. I want a really, really lovely fine spray and a gentle spray. So don't hold it at an angle, because again, you're going to wash that soil. You're going to mess with that nice level that you had on that seed flat. Try and hold it from the top down so it goes directly over and you're not moving that soil. Always try and label things as you're seeding, especially if you're doing different things in one flat. I know one thinks, oh, I'll remember, but it's so easy to forget, and then it's difficult when those things first pop up to try and remember what it was that you had where. So keep labeling as you go. So what I would do here, once this is wet, then I sow my seed. Then I simply put a little soil over the top of that, depending on the nature of your seed. So the general rule of thumb is you want that seed at least twice the depth of the seed. So you want, if I had a really fine seed, something like petunias or bedding begonias, I simply want a dusting of soil over the top. If I have larger seed like nasturtiums or peas or something, I want to put a thicker layer of soil on the top of that. And then because the bottom soil is already wet, all I have to do is go and do a light watering over the top now to get that top layer of soil wet. Depending on what you're growing, some plants we simply use a single seed per plant. Other plants we use multiple seeds, so we do what we call multi-sowing. Anytime you've purchased a basil plant in the grocery store, that is a cluster of seeds. It's not a simple seed. Now, think to yourself, anytime you've seen one of those really sort of poor-looking, scraggly basil plants at the grocery store, that's because the grower might have been a little greedy. They didn't put enough seeds in there. So things like basil, cilantro, parsley, many of our annual bloomers, alyssum, we actually have a bunch of plants growing in there. It could be 6 seeds, 8 seeds, 10 seeds. So by having multiple plants in there, they intergrow. It gives us a nice, dense, full-looking plant. So do a little homework prior to growing your plants and figure out, do I want a single seed per plant or do I want a cluster of seeds? If it was something, like I said, like a alyssum with a cluster of seeds, and each cell of the cell pack that you see here, I'd take a little pinch of seed, like a pinch of salt, and try and spread them sort of evenly throughout that cell. If you're using last year's seed or seed older than that, that's when we would want to oversow. So I want to compensate for the fact that I might not get the same germination rate that that seed had last year. So sometimes the seed packet will tell you the germination rate, it'll say 80%, 90%, whatever it is. That's going to start to go down from year to year. So then you want to oversow to compensate for that. Now there's all sorts of different methods to try and sow that seed. For those of you that have a super steady hand, that's fantastic. And you might be able to do simply what you're seeing in that picture on the right here. Just hold that seed packet and ever so gently shake him out. Some of us don't have a hand that's as steady as that. Sometimes the seed is so fine that you can have the steadiest hand in the world and it's still impossible to be able to spread it out evenly. If you have a super, super fine seed, I would recommend mixing it with something, sand for example, and then putting it maybe in a salt shaker and shaking it out that way. If you have a seed that's really difficult to see, it's the same color as your soil, I always say don't try and get all that seed out in the first run. Just go over that seed flat or that cell pack numerous times. Keep going over it. You're much better off going over it multiple times to get that seed out than trying to get all the seed out in that first run. Because usually what's going to happen is most of that seed will drop out right at the beginning of that flat. And if you have a very fine seed, you could have 5,000-10,000 plants coming up within a few square inches. So that's something we want to avoid. So look at your seed and decide, do you need an aid to work with or can you simply do it by hand? Sometimes the growers made it easy on us, like lettuce seed for example. What they'll often do is they might cluster 5-6 seeds and put it in a little seed capsule. You'll see it's coated on the outside. And that way I can just put one of those coatings in each cell pack and I'll have my 6 seeds or whatever it is in there. Sometimes they will have coated seed with a really bright color, also again making it really easy and nice and visible to see it once it's gone onto that seed flat. Other times you won't see it and you're simply going to have to trust that you put it out nice and evenly. Seed bombs are really something that's used outdoors, especially with native seed. You know, what you're doing is you're really just making what you can see in this picture. It sort of looks a bit like a dumpling, that you could make it up with clay or anything else. And you've got a variety of different plants in there many times, and you just, especially in areas that are hard to reach outdoors, you can just throw them. Now, depending on what you're growing, like I said, you might be direct seeding outdoors. Even outdoors, again, you want to try and make it easier because not all seed is as visible as the one that's in this picture here. So try and ahead of time map out what your row is. Try and mark it out. Some people might have a string along it. You might just dig a little trench. You might want to try and mark it out ahead of time between which distances you're going to have these things, because it's so hard with some seed. You know, if you're thinking carrots, for example, you don't want to end up having a million carrots and having to consistently go back and thin over and over. Now, we don't all have wonderful greenhouses to start things in, so we have to try and improvise a little bit. If you do have a greenhouse, that's fantastic. However, most of us, even if we have a greenhouse, it's what we call a hobby greenhouse. So often it's lacking in a heat source. So we're really sort of exposed to the elements and we have to work with nature. We can only start growing things as temperatures get warmer outdoor and light levels get higher. So most of us are going to start things indoors. Now you can very, very easily especially if you're a little handy, set something up yourself. You don't have to go out and purchase an expensive grow rack. You can make your own. Fluorescent light is absolutely sufficient. So fluorescent light bulbs give off a nice blue light. It's a cool light, so I don't have to worry about burning those plants. It is absolutely sufficient for vegetative growth, and it is inexpensive. So try and purchase a unit, or try and build it yourself. Get a few fluorescent light bulbs in there. Sometimes you can have a little pulley chain on that light so that you can set that light how close you want it to your plants. Even if that light is fixed, maybe I can move what my plant flat is sitting on, so I can move that up and down from my light. Once that seed germinates, I really want to make sure that I have that light source as close to those plants as possible. So you literally want to have it imminently above those plants. Don't feel you need to have it, a foot or two up so that you're not going to burn those plants. Remember, it is a cool light. The closer to the plants you have it, the better. If you don't have a lighting system at all, try and find the lightest area in your house. Have it at a windowsill, somewhere south-facing. Usually when we start these things early in the year, we really don't have to worry about that sun being too strong or scorching those plants. It's usually not strong enough yet when we're growing seeds. So our ultimate goal with sowing seeds obviously is germination. The next goal is trying to get uniform germination. So how do we achieve this? Just a few basics. I want to try and make sure that I have even soil moisture and soil temperature throughout that seed flat. So if you look at the picture right here, you can see I have most of my germination in the center of that flat. Now that could be due to several things. It could be due to me not having spread that seed evenly. Many times it'll happen that we put the majority of the seed in the middle of that flat and we miss the edges. We don't want to spill seed over the side. We're cautious on the edges and we miss them. Try and avoid that. Many times it's going to be wetter in the middle because, again, we're missing those edges. The edges are going to dry out the quickest. That's where the air is getting to it. So try and make sure it's not sitting dry at the edges because, again, that'll lead to uneven germination. Try and make sure the temperature is consistent throughout that flat. So if you only have one heating mat, don't try and fit a bunch of flats on there. Do one at a time. And then try and make sure you have good seed to soil contact. This would be something that if I just filled my seed flat initially with that potting mix, before I water it, I'm just going to pick up that flat on either side and I'm going to knock it down on my bench a couple times, and that's just going to help that soil settle in there so that once I do sow that seed and water it and everything else, I'm going to have better seed to soil contact. Having that very fine germination mix also helps me have good seed to soil contact. Problems such as compaction and soil crusting is really something that you're going to deal with when it's outdoors with direct sowing. So if you have areas that are compacted or you see a hard soil crust, germination might be a problem. Or if you have varying soil temperatures or light exposures throughout your garden. Now, I was speaking a little bit about old seed earlier on. So don't think that that germination rate is going to drop drastically. Most plants it's going to go down gradually. So like I said, by all means use last year's seed, but overcompensate for the lack of germination. Maybe try and look up that plant ahead of time. With vegetables, some vegetables are going to have a very long lifespan. It might be 5, 6, 7 years. Other vegetables, onions, chives, for example, might have a short lifespan. It might just be a year. In that case, maybe it is worth me investing in a new seed packet. Now, if you're storing your own seed, regardless of whether you collected it from your garden or whether you purchased it, you always want to follow a few basic rules. You want to keep that seed dry. And that's absolutely critical because we don't want mold or anything growing on that seed, so keep it dry. You don't want any temperature fluctuations, and you want to make sure that it's more or less cool. So for example, I wouldn't want to have it lying out in direct sunlight if I had a greenhouse. If I'm collecting my own seed from the garden, first I have to dry it prior to storing it. Now if I'm collecting my own seed, it could either be what we refer to as wet or dry seed. Wet seed would be things like tomato and squash. Dry seed would be something like beans or peas in a pod. The dry seed's always easier. I can just go ahead and let it mature and ripen naturally on the plant. It's going to dry out all by itself. I don't have to worry as much. The wet seed's a little trickier. So as you know, when you try and remove that seed, you're going to have that sort of pulp or fleshy substance that clings to the seed. So a practice that was traditionally used a lot is fermentation. So tomatoes, for example, I would take that pulp, put it in a glass of water, leave it in that water, that room temperature water. Depending on the temperature, it could be 3 days, 5 days, also depending on your plant. What's going to happen is that that pulp is going to naturally start to disengage from that seed, and it's going to rise to the top. Also, that seed, any viable, good, healthy seed is going to be heavy. It's going to sink to the bottom. Any weak seed is going to rise to the top. It's going to be a lighter seed. So you can then just skim all that muck out of there very easily. Also, by allowing that seed to sit in that water for several days, you're going to have fermentation taking place. This was also traditionally used a lot more, because during that fermentation process, what's going to happen is you're actually going to kill off a lot of those pathogens that are on the outside of that seed coat. Then you can just go ahead and pour that water out and dry that seed. Depending on the seed, if you were doing something like perennials or native plants, you might have a lot of what we call chaff with that seed. So all that sort of extra plant material, bulky stuff. It's always good practice to try and remove that. You'll get more uniform, better germination when you sow that seed if you can remove a lot of that chaff material. So winnowing is also something that was used a lot more traditionally. And the very simplest form of winnowing would simply be if I took a bowl of seed that still had that chaff in it and held it up very high and slowly poured it out outdoors, where I had a slight little air current and I had a nice pot underneath to catch my seed. That viable seed, again, is going to be heavier in nature. That chaff is going to be lighter. So just that slight air movement current is going to move that chaff along a little bit. So it's going to land next to my container. That viable seed is going to drop down in my container. So there's lots of variations of that process, but that's sort of the basics of it. Now when you store that seed, many times people might store that seed in the fridge. Some might store it in the garage. Like I said, if it's something you've hand collected in your garden, go ahead and put it in paper bags. That way it can breathe, it can wick out that moisture. Don't put it in plastic. If you're going to put it in the fridge, you can leave it in paper packets if it's something that bought, but try and put it in something airtight, like a Tupperware container, and keep consistently taking it out of that fridge, maybe every month, and taking a look at it and just ensuring that it is not sitting damp. Some people put those little silicone sachets in there to wick out that moisture, but always just check it. Keeping in mind a commercial grower would have a nice walk-in cooler and they would keep extracting the moisture out of the air, so be aware of that. If you are storing it out in the garage, for example, make sure that it's in something that's sealed so you don't have rodents or anything else coming in there and eating that seed. Again, if you have old seed and you're not sure how viable it is, you can carry out what we call a germination test. So just take a small sample of that seed, count the seed you have, sow it, see how much of it comes up, and that'll tell you what your germination percentage is, and then you can adjust accordingly. So I could sow twice as much seed if I feel it's gone down by 50%, for example. That way I'll still get the germination that I want. The other thing I should mention is anytime you are collecting seed in your garden, just be aware, once you start collecting seed and growing things, whether you realize it or not, you've become a plant breeder. So you really want to try and look for things like which plant looks the strongest and the healthiest, meaning it has the best genes, which plant has the characteristics that I'm seeking, maybe it's fragrance, maybe it's flavor, anything or everything. If you have a plant that you love the characteristics of and you don't want it to get watered down with other traits, try and keep it far away from, if you had a tomato, keep it far away from any other ones in your garden so it's not going to cross-pollinate. So once we've sowed our seed, like I said, we need that seed to germinate. Now most seed have a dormancy requirement within them. That's essential because if I was thinking of a seed, let's think of a tomato seed, that seed otherwise could literally start to germinate whilst it's still in that tomato fruit. So seeds need to have that dormancy requirement so that they won't break dormancy and germinate until conditions are favorable. Now we have two different large groupings in that dormancy requirements. We have what we call exogenous and endogenous. You don't have to remember these terms. Just remember that one is outside the embryo and one is inside the embryo. So the embryo is that vital part within the seed that's going to grow into our plant. So the ones that are outside the embryo are physical or mechanical. So if I'm thinking of a hard seed coat, something that I would have to nick that seed coat. If I was thinking chemical, again, I might want to nick that seed coat with something chemical, like an acid, for example. Or if I'm thinking something that's inside the embryo, so that would be physiological, morphological, or a combination of both. So that would be when that seed falls off that plant, it is not yet ready to germinate, it's not ripe, it's not mature, it has to keep maturing. So by looking at the seed, we might not see that, but within that seed, that embryo is maturing until it's ready to germinate. So the very most common forms of breaking dormancy are temperature requirement, moisture requirement, and light requirement. Now we usually don't even think of these. We go and purchase a pack of seeds, we sow them, we don't think that that seed actually needs something to break dormancy, like moisture, like temperature. Because these are things we're naturally providing. We're watering that seed flat, we've provided moisture. It's usually in a favorable temperature environment, it's got the right temperature, and it's got the light it needs. But those are the three most critical forms of breaking dormancy. So you're going to come across this term if you start reading up on seeds called imbibition, and that is simply that process of that seed taking up water and swelling up. That seed's going to take up that water, it's going to help it break that seed coat, and then what's going to happen is that metabolic process, that activity is going to kick in and that plant is going to start to grow. Now sometimes it'll be sufficient just to water that seed flat and sow your seed. Other times you might want to take that seed, like with beans for example, and go ahead and soak them for a day prior. Some seeds you might want to soak it several days and keep switching out that water every day so it doesn't get mucky. But moisture is absolutely critical for many seeds to break that seed coat and to kick off that metabolic process. Next is temperature, and here you can see that heat mat that I've been speaking of. Very simple, easy to use, inexpensive heat mat, really worth the investment. You'll have it for life. When I'm speaking of temperature with seeds, I'm speaking soil temperature. So don't try and turn the heat in your house up to 90 degrees to get that seed to germinate. We want warm soil temperatures. We don't want hot air temperatures. So we want bottom heat. So that's when the heating mat is wonderful. Keeping in mind that soil is moist. Moist soil is always going to be cooler than dry soil, but we need moist soil. So that heating mat is really going to warm it up nicely from the bottom up. Do you need temperature to break that dormancy? Not necessarily, depending on the seed you have, but many times it's going to speeden up that process. So if I were growing peppers, for example, I could reduce it from 3 weeks to 10 days by increasing that temperature. So if I have something that's slow, bottom heat is fantastic. Next is cold treatment. So if we're thinking of our hardy plants, most of our hardy plants have that requirement that they have to undergo that cold period. So it's a certain amount of cold, a consecutive period of cold. So it could be a month, it could be 2 months, depending on what that plant needs. It has to have that cold period before it can break dormancy. Now if we want to mimic that cold period that it would have naturally had outdoors, we can go ahead and put it in the refrigerator. You do not have to put it in the freezer. Even if that plant is hardy, the refrigerator is absolutely plausible. Just above freezing is perfect. Now we have dry and moist stratification. So stratification, again, it's that cold period requirement. If that plant required dry stratification, I'm just going to take that seed, I'm going to put it in the fridge, I'm going to look up ahead of time how many weeks it needs before it'll break dormancy. I'm just going to check on that seed regularly to make sure it's not molding or getting too moist, and then I'm going to go ahead and sow it. If we have what's referred to as moist stratification, then I actually need to put that seed in moist soil or moist moss or anything that's going to retain that moisture, and then put it in the refrigerator. So keep in mind, anytime we're trying to break dormancy, we're just trying to copy what would naturally happen outdoors in the native habitat of that plant. So moist stratification, if you can imagine, early in the year, in the springtime, the ground is very wet and the ground is very cold. That's what we're trying to mimic. So you'll come across the term stratification, you'll also come across the term vernalization or cold treatment. Some plants have double dormancy. Not many, but some do have double dormancy, and that's going to be where you have to go through that whole process twice. So you might have had them in that refrigerator for that time period, you might have brought them out again, and you might have to do the whole thing over. So plants like that in nature, in the outdoors, it might take several years for that plant to germinate. So things, for example, offhand, bladdernut, for example, trilliums, you would require double dormancy. Next is breaking that seed coat. So that's referred to as scarification. So any plants that you know that have a really hard seed coat, if I went and sowed that as is, I might get a few to germinate. Otherwise, I might have to wait a really long time for them to germinate. So we want to help along that process and get good, even germination. So seed like that in nature, what would have probably happened is that seed would have passed through an animal's gut, and those acids in that animal's stomach would have broken that seed coat. Seed would have passed out of that animal, would have been sitting in a pile of wonderful, nutritious manure ready to grow. When we want to copy that, we can do several things. Either we can try and nick that seed or rub it on a little sandpaper. Sometimes we'll just take seeds together and rub them together. Anything of doing any of those treatments, just try and be careful not to damage the embryo. So look at that seed a little closer and be careful what side you're doing it on, and don't do too much of it. Commercially, many times they'll use acid. I wouldn't recommend that at home unless you're experienced with it and know your plant very well. Same with hot water. Sometimes they'll dip seed into boiling water to shock and break that seed coat. Again, both hot water and acid, unless you're experienced with doing it and you know those plants well, I wouldn't recommend it, because you could do more harm than good. Because depending on the plant, it might just be 10 seconds in that hot water. And then our last one here is heat or fire. So if we think of prairie plants, if we think of lots of plants around the world, South Africa, Australia, that are adapted to fire, you can imagine that fire is swept through that landscape. There's no competition for light, for available soil space, wonderful nutrients with that ash being watered into the soil, prime growing conditions. So some plants will not break dormancy until they get that heat. Other plants are so specialized they actually need smoke. And some plants are very specialized and they're finding out more and more with that. It might actually be a real specific smoke made up from burning specific plants from that native habitat. So depending on what you're growing, if you're having troubles and something is not germinating and you feel you've done everything right, that's when you want to start to research that plant a little bit and find out, does it have real specific dormancy requirements. Luckily for us, most of the plants that you purchase out in your garden center, the breeder's done the work for us. They germinate easily and readily. Then our last one, and this is what I was referring to, is within the seed as opposed to outside the seed. Some seeds are not mature enough when they fall off that plant. So that seed is going to continue ripening. The embryo within that seed, and you can see it here in the picture within this ginkgo seed, is undeveloped at the time when it drops off that plant, and it's going to continue growing and developing within the seed prior to it germinating. So once you've got your seed to germinate and it's growing, one of the biggest problems many growers have is dampening off. So we really want to make sure we avoid this. It should be very easy to avoid if you know the basics. Many times when you have dampening off, your soil temperatures are cool, your soil is too moist, and you have a lack of air movement. Make absolutely certain that when that seed is first germinating and you have those real young seedlings, we want our soil temps to be warm. We do not want our soil to be very moist. So keep in mind that those seedlings have next to no roots. They need very, very little water. Initially, we want to water that seed flat thoroughly prior to sowing the seed. Once that seed germinates, we want to keep those seed flats on the dry side. We only want to water them real minimally, keeping in mind those roots barely go down at all. The more that plant grows, the more it roots down and down, the deeper we water it each time. But initially, very, very minimal superficial watering. Try and get some air movement in there. I know it's not that easy indoors, but try and get a fan going. Don't have it blasting, but just a little air movement. Have some light on there. Again, make sure you have some form of artificial lighting or a very bright windowsill. And then try and make sure that everything's clean and sterile. So if you're using last year's seed flats, make sure maybe that you just washed them with a little bleach. Try and make sure you use a potting soil or seeding mix that's sterile. When you get dampening off, this is pretty much what it looks like. From one day to the next, all of a sudden those little seedlings are simply going to flop and fall over. And when you look at the base of that stem, you see it's just kind of turned to mush. Once this happens, there's no going back from this. So we really want to try and avoid this. So once you have those healthy seedlings, try and catch it within that optimal window when you're transplanting. Don't do it too early because you're going to stress that plant if it's not large enough to be moved yet. But don't leave it too late, because once that plant's in there too long, like I said, it starts to intergrow with the other plants, it runs out of light, it runs out of soil space. So have that optimal window. If you're looking at this seedling on the right in this picture right here, this is perfect. I wouldn't want to wait any longer than this. When you are transplanting, always try and take those seedlings from the bottom up. So don't pull on that seedling stem. If you can use a tool, if you use your finger, if you take that plastic pot and kind of squeeze it and tease those plants out, but try and take them from the bottom up so that you're not damaging the roots and so that you don't have to manhandle the top of that seedling too much, because keep in mind they're really, really fragile as seedlings. If you have a clay pot, you might want to try and knock that whole thing out altogether, but always go from the bottom up. Never grab them on the top because it's very easy to break them at that stage, and always try and hold them right at the base of that stem when you are handling them. That's where they're least likely to break. Especially if I'm looking at all the spinach on the right here, I need to tease each of these plants apart, be very, very gentle. This is just a picture to show you what I think is like a perfect stage to transplant. The plant is not too large, they're not competing with each other yet, they're just starting to put out that second set of true leaves. This would be your ideal transplanting stage right here. When you are transplanting that plant, make sure that when you plant it, keep it absolutely at the same soil level that it was prior. So very few plants are forgiving of being planted too high or low, especially too low. They'll suffocate. Planted too high, they'll dry out and get stressed. Keep them at the same level, and then make sure that you firm them in nicely. So you want to firm them in by the soil to make sure that they get that nice soil to root contact and that they're anchored in well. And then finally, if you do start things indoors, keep in mind, even if it's a hardy plant, maybe it's a cool season veggie, if I've started something indoors, it is not hardened. So I need to harden it and acclimatize it to those outdoor temperatures and light levels. So you might want to bring it out initially only in the daytime, bring it in at night. Maybe you'll put it in something like a cold frame so you can seal it up at night. If you've grown a warm crop later in the year, maybe it's not temperatures you need to worry about, maybe it's light levels. Adjust things slowly so that they don't get burnt right away. And then keep in mind, anytime I'm moving something from indoors to outdoors, it's going to have a lot more light, it's going to have air movement, it's going to dry out quicker. So keep an eye on it and water it accordingly. So that is seed sowing in a nutshell. I hope that's given you a basic idea of which plants might you want to grow from seed, which things would grow well, what characteristics to look for in plants. When to start things, how to start things, and how to take care of them. If you have any questions at all, please go ahead and put them in the chat box. I'll do my best to answer them. If I cannot answer them, maybe another one of the credible people online will help me, or I'll get back to you. If you think of your questions later on down the line, once you're actually doing this, maybe this month, next month, you're sitting down and sowing your seed, go ahead and get in touch with me. You can see my contact details on the screen, and I'll be happy to help you out as best as I can. Otherwise, thank you very much for sacrificing your evening and joining me. It's been my pleasure. I went 1 minute over. Sorry about that. Otherwise, thank you and have a lovely evening. And all the very best with sowing your seeds. I hope they do well. Like I said, there's nothing more gratifying than watching those seeds pop up for the first time. It's a wonderful feeling. And like I said, it's an early start on growing in the outdoors, even when it's still cold and miserable outside, as it is. So, happy growing this year. Can I unmute you, Sarah? Let's see. Depends what your question is.
Okay, she's unmuted now. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, thank you very much. So we have a question from Chicago about winter sowing. Kim, do you have experience or suggestions about maybe like winter sowing in milk jugs?
Winter sowing in milk jugs. You mean cutting off the milk jug and doing it directly outside?
Yes.
I mean, any container that you can use is fine to help. I mean, all you try to do is sort of keep things a little warmer. Depending on what you're growing, I mean, if it's something really hardy, it doesn't matter if you have that jug or not. If it's not, I would just try and push it out to later in the season. You could use egg cartons. I mean, any form of plastic, if you're trying to trap the sun in there, is great. The only problem with those things is you really need to keep an eye on it because things can start to stretch. You really need to get air in there. If the air doesn't move in there, that's when they start to get susceptible to all sorts of different things. So it'd be something, yeah, start it off early, but then keep an eye on it so you can lift it off quickly and rapidly once it starts to grow. Does that help?
Yep, we're nodding. You can't see us.
Is there anybody else in there in virtual land?
Yeah, I think maybe we have another question here. You may not be able to. Do you want to maybe come a little closer?
I'm referring to when you were doing your kind of makeshift grow house with the fluorescent lights, and you said as soon as you start getting the germination that you should have the light close to it. How long? I mean, do you do a timer? Is it 12 hours of light, or what do you recommend?
12 hours is good. So I know some people try and keep that light on all the time. Don't do that. Whatever you do, they do need that resting stage, but 12 hours sounds perfect to me. I mean, you could do 14 hours as well. 12, 14 hours. Also depends on what you're growing. You know, usually our earlier crops don't need as high light levels as our later crops, you know, our warm season crops. But 12, 14 hours depending on what you're growing.
Okay.
I see here, at what point do you fertilize? Usually just once you start to get a root system on that plant. So if I see that root system coming out of that pot, I start to see some roots coming out of that pot, that's a great time to fertilize. It's also going to depend on what you're growing. Some plants might not need much fertilizer, others do. Just make sure that once you start to fertilize initially that you're doing it at half strength. So don't start off right away at full strength when they are seedlings. And some things you might not want to fertilize. So some plants, you know, if I'm growing vegetables, you're better off trying to grow them cool and not fertilizing initially to try and hold them back and not have them grow as fast. You don't want them to stretch as much. You know, sort of give them tough love, grow them cooler, don't fertilize them initially, and have them grow slower and stockier and sturdier. So, tomatoes, for example, don't use ammonium nitrate, but anything that you're growing, I always say, because you can never know the crop schedule of every plant there is. Once you've decided what you want to grow, I mean, these days we have the wonderful tool of Google. Enter that plant. Every plant there is, somebody's done it before you, and there's a production cycle. It'll tell you basics like what temperature should it be grown at? Does it do better with bottom heat or not? When is a good time to start fertilizing? You know, because some things, I'm saying many things do well cool. You know, there are a few things that don't do well cool. So just try and look it up and get a few basic pointers. Let's see. I had trouble with cilantro from seed. Is there a trick to getting strong plants? Really, you shouldn't have a problem with seed. Just cilantro is one of those ones that you want to multi-sow. So you want to put a cluster of seeds. You don't want a single seed, otherwise you're going to get a very thin, spindly plant. So put a grouping of seeds in there. It's also one of those ones that you would want to grow cool. So don't grow it too warm. And other than that, you shouldn't have any problems. If you can get some air movement in there, that would be great too. They like that as well. That's one of the things we never have indoors and we don't think of very much is air movement, but air movement is critical. So when you walk into a large-scale greenhouse, you're always going to hear those fans running at any given time. Air movement's really important to keep things healthy. Other than that, like I said, shouldn't have any problems at all with cilantro. Grow it cool, multi-sow it, and do be sure to keep it on the dry side as well. So it's very easy to overwater those. Keep them dry. Do we have anything else? Like I said, if you think of questions once you start to grow something, or if you want to try and remember something I said, or if you're having trouble, maybe something isn't germinating, or you're wondering when to start things, or what temperature to grow things at, get in touch with me. Email is the best way. You can always get a hold of me. Otherwise, I'll let you get to your telly and enjoy the evening. Thank you for joining me. It's my pleasure. And happy growing. I hope you do well. Try and make this world a greener place.